Imagine a courtroom thick with tension, not the kind you see in scripted dramas, but the kind that makes even silence feel deafening. Cameras fixed in place, eyes trained on every movement, every breath. A federal judge at the bench, a congresswoman seated across from her, and an audience, both in the room and online, waiting for something real to finally break through the noise. This wasn't just another political moment. This was a collision between authority and accountability, between someone who wields power and someone unafraid to question it. And when that question came, simple, direct, and unfiltered, it didn't just hang in the air. It shattered it. In that single moment, the courtroom wasn't divided by party lines or ideology. It was divided by something far deeper, truth versus narrative. For months leading up to this encounter, debates had raged across headlines, social feeds, and primetime panels. Words like bias, integrity, and justice were thrown around until they almost lost their meaning. Each side had their story, their version of reality. Yet beneath the noise, a single truth remained buried, waiting for the right person to bring it to light. That person turned out to be Jasmine Crockett. Known for her fearless candor and courtroom precision, she's not one to back down from questions that make others uncomfortable. But on that day, it wasn't just about her courage. It was about a nation watching, wondering, would anyone ever hold power accountable again? And across from her, Judge Aileen Cannon, a figure both respected and controversial depending on who you ask. Appointed to uphold the law without favor or fear, she found herself under the kind of scrutiny that no robe can shield. Every word she said, every pause she took was dissected, replayed, and analyzed. When the two finally faced each other, it wasn't a clash of personalities. It was a collision of worlds, one built on public trust, the other on judicial restraint. Now, imagine being in that room. You could hear the faint clicks of pens, the shuffle of papers, the rhythmic hum of whispered predictions. Every journalist, every aide, every bystander knew something was about to happen. They just didn't know what form it would take. Then came the question. Not loud, not dramatic, but deliberate. A question that cut through months of talking points, through layers of spin and speculation, and suddenly there was no reply, just silence. A silence that said more than any prepared statement could, because sometimes the most powerful thing in a room full of voices is the truth no one can refute. This wasn't just about two people in a courtroom. It was about something much larger, the state of truth in a time of noise. How easily perception can replace proof. How quickly confidence can drown out conscience. In that moment, millions watching realize something uncomfortable. It's not that we can't find the truth, it's that too often we stop looking once we find what feels right. As one observer later put it, in a world full of confident fiction, it only takes one person with facts to change everything. And that's exactly what this encounter represented. A rare, unscripted moment where facts fought back. Why does this matter? Because whether you stand on the left, right, or somewhere in between, this story isn't about politics. It's about how power reacts when questioned, and how the truth behaves when cornered. By the end of this story, you'll see how one question didn't just challenge a judge, it challenged an entire system's comfort with illusion. You'll uncover what was really said, what wasn't, and why that silence spoke louder than words. So stay with this, because sometimes all it takes is one person, one question, to remind us that truth still has a voice, and when it does, even the most powerful rooms fall silent. The silence that followed that question didn't appear out of nowhere. It was years in the making, the product of political storms, shifting loyalties, and a justice system caught in the crossfire of public perception. To understand that moment, the one where Judge Aileen Cannon and Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett locked eyes, you have to understand the world that built it. The setting, a nation on edge, the hearing room sat at the intersection of law and spectacle, a space where truth was supposed to speak clearly, yet often echoed faintly under the weight of agendas. The polished wood, the flags, the cameras, everything about it symbolized authority. But authority in that moment felt fragile. Every word spoken inside those walls would ripple outward into a divided nation, one ready to interpret rather than to listen. For months, the judiciary had been at the center of public debate. Decisions that once passed quietly through legal channels now trended online within seconds. Judges became symbols, law became narrative, and the people, once passive observers, were now the jury of public opinion. That's where Judge Aileen Cannon found herself, a name often spoken in whispers of controversy. For some, she represented balance in a chaotic system. For others, bias cloaked in judicial decorum. Her rulings had made headlines. Her courtroom a stage for deeper battles about fairness, democracy, and trust. And facing her, Jasmine Crockett, sharp-tongued, relentless, and unflinching. A former attorney turned Congresswoman, she was no stranger to scrutiny herself. But she carried something many in Washington had long misplaced: the willingness to ask uncomfortable questions. The pattern. Before the moment in the weeks leading to the confrontation, the country had been watching a familiar story play out, legal hearings morphing into political theater. Each side claiming moral ground, while truth became an afterthought. Cable news panels debated personalities more than principles. Social media turned complex cases into memes and outrage. Every citizen became a commentator, but few, true witnesses. And yet beneath that noise, something quieter stirred, a fatigue with the performance of truth. People were starting to sense that the facts no longer dictated outcomes, narratives did. That's what made this particular hearing different. There was anticipation not just for answers, but for accountability, a rare thing in a system that often rewards appearances over honesty. It was more than political tension. It was moral exhaustion, the room before the question. When the session began, you could feel it. The atmosphere wasn't just formal. It was electric. Cameras blinked like patient eyes waiting for a story to unfold. Reporters leaned in, ready to transcribe every exchange. Judge Cannon maintained her composure, every gesture precise, every word measured. She knew the eyes of the nation were upon her. Crockett, on the other hand, sat steady but ready, her notes prepared, her questions sharper than they appeared on paper. As opening statements rolled on, the conversation felt predictable, procedural, almost safe. But beneath the polite tone, the tension built like a drumbeat beneath the dialogue. Every time someone avoided a direct answer, Crockett's pen stopped moving. Every time an evasive phrase surfaced, her expression tightened, not in anger, but in calculation. She wasn't there for sound bites. She was there for truth. The misconception, confidence as credibility, outside that room. The narrative had already been written, at least by the loudest voices online. Some believed Cannon's authority was unshakable, that her role placed her beyond reproach. Others saw Crockett as too brash, too emotional, too willing to challenge the system. But that's where most were wrong, because confidence and credibility are not the same thing. And both women knew it. Cannon's authority came from the system she represented. Crockett's credibility came from the truth she carried. One relied on position, the other on principle. That clash, silent but undeniable, was the heartbeat of the moment that followed, the emotional undercurrent. Even before Crockett spoke, something had shifted in the room. Her tone was calm, but her eyes were unyielding. She wasn't there to embarrass or provoke. She was there to expose. She represented a generation tired of selective accountability, of seeing rules applied differently depending on who stood accused or who held the gavel. And that, more than anything, made this confrontation inevitable. In her calm but cutting way, Crockett began laying out a pattern, moments where decisions seemed inconsistent, interpretations appeared skewed, and justice looked uneven. Each example wasn't just a critique of one judge, it was a mirror held up to a system increasingly unsure of its reflection. The audience felt it, that rising discomfort that comes when the truth begins to feel too close to name. The tipping point, the build-up wasn't about spectacle. It was about pressure. Pressure from a public that wanted answers. Pressure from a media ecosystem that rewards outrage. Pressure from institutions terrified of losing credibility. And in the center of it, two women embodying that conflict in real time. Every exchange, every pause, pulled the tension tighter until it reached the point where no one could look away. And that's when it happened. The moment everyone had been waiting for. The question that would slice through the fog, challenge power, and make a room full of voices fall completely silent. The air in the room seemed to tighten, The hum of side conversations fell away. Every camera lens sharpened its focus, and there in the stillness Jasmine Crockett leaned forward, not with aggression, but with precision. What came next wasn't performance. It was surgery, the moment before. Judge Aileen Cannon had been speaking, her tone measured, almost rehearsed. Her words carried the authority of her robe, balanced, careful, layered in neutrality. But if you listened closely, there was something missing: directness. She referenced ongoing considerations, judicial discretion, and contextual integrity. It was the language of power, elegant but evasive. Crockett didn't interrupt. She let Cannon's sentences float and fade, her expression unreadable. Only when the judge paused did she move. A small, deliberate shift forward, pen tapping once against the table. Then she spoke, the question that broke the silence. Her voice was calm, almost disarmingly so. "Your Honor," she began, "at what point does discretion stop being neutral and start being selective?" The room froze. It wasn't shouted. It wasn't framed as an accusation. It was a surgical strike, precise and undeniable. Judge Cannon blinked once, as if buying time. Around them, reporters glanced up from their notes. The hum of the cameras grew louder in the quiet. Crockett didn't move. She didn't need to. The power of the question wasn't in volume. It was in truth's simplicity. The reaction. For a moment, the judge didn't answer. She adjusted her glasses. She inhaled. She glanced toward her notes. Silence stretched thin, like glass about to crack. When she finally spoke, her tone had changed, a shade tighter, a fraction more defensive. "Congresswoman, the court operates on the principles of impartial application. Every decision is guided by the law, not preference." A fair answer on paper. But everyone in the room could feel it, the tension beneath the words. Crockett nodded slowly. "I appreciate that, Your Honor, but impartiality isn't just claimed. It's demonstrated. When outcomes repeatedly favor one side, even unintentionally, that pattern speaks louder than procedure." Another pause. This time, Cannon's eyes lifted, meeting Crockett's directly. The silence wasn't empty. It was heavy, the kind that carries truth inside it. The shift, that single exchange, transformed the room. It was no longer about one question. It was about what that question revealed. For months, commentators, analysts, and partisans had argued endlessly over bias and intent. But in that brief back and forth, the issue crystallized. Can justice still be trusted when its protectors refuse to question themselves? Cannon's posture stiffened slightly, the body language of someone who feels the ground shifting under their feet. Crockett, sensing it, didn't press harder. She simply let the silence linger, long enough for everyone to feel its weight. Then she added, "I'm not questioning your authority. Judge, I'm questioning what happens to trust when authority stops listening." That line didn't just echo, it landed. Even the reporters, used to political theater, looked up from their screens. This wasn't theater. It was truth wrapped in diplomacy. The energy in the room, every face told a story. Some leaned forward, mesmerized. Others sat frozen, unsure which way to breathe. The sound of pen on paper was gone. No one wanted to miss a word. Cannon began to speak again, but her voice carried a subtle tremor. She defended her record, her reasoning, her oath, but the rhythm of certainty had faltered. Each word sounded like it was being weighed against the silence that followed Crockett's question. Truth has a way of doing that, making confidence hesitate. And as the dialogue unfolded, it became clear. This wasn't a battle of personalities. It was a revelation of values. The turning point, Crockett continued. Calm, factual, relentless. She cited specific cases, decisions and patterns, each one connecting to a larger narrative of uneven accountability. Her tone never rose. Her words never wavered. Cannon responded with formality, but something had changed. She was no longer the unshakable figure of authority. She was a participant in a reckoning. Then came the second blow, not an accusation, but a reflection. "Your Honor," Crockett said softly, "do you believe justice should feel fair or just appear fair?" That question hung longer than the first. It wasn't legal. It was human, and that made it unstoppable. Cannon didn't answer immediately. Her jaw tightened. The courtroom, now utterly still, waited. Finally, she said, "Justice must be both." But even as she said it, the audience knew that must was a hope, not a reality, the cracking of the facade. The conversation moved on, but the atmosphere didn't recover. The facade of composure had cracked ever so slightly, revealing something raw beneath it. Discomfort, maybe even doubt. Every word that followed seemed to orbit that unspoken truth, that the law, no matter how structured, is only as impartial as the people trusted to uphold it. Crockett leaned back, her expression neutral, her pen still. She didn't gloat. She didn't smirk. She just let the truth breathe. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was honest. For the first time in a long time, the audience wasn't hearing spin. They were witnessing clarity. The cinematic beat every camera turned. Every microphone captured that lingering pause. The world outside would soon replay it millions of times, frame by frame, word by word. But for those in that room, it wasn't about playback. It was about presence, because everyone knew they had just seen something rare, a moment where power was reminded it could still be questioned. The rhythm of control had faltered, and in its place came something far stronger, accountability. And when Crockett finally leaned forward and said, almost as a whisper, "That's all I needed to know," it wasn't just the end of a question, it was the beginning of a reckoning. Aftermath. Within the moment, Judge Cannon gathered her notes, her expression unreadable once again. But the tone of the room had changed. When she spoke next, her words were steadier, more cautious, like someone aware that the world was now listening differently. No one applauded. No one interrupted. But the energy had shifted permanently, because everyone there, the staffers, the journalists, the citizens watching the live stream, understood what had just happened. Power had been confronted not by rage, but by reason, and reason had won the moment. The cameras would later capture that still frame, Cannon looking down, Crockett meeting her gaze, silence stretching between them like a line in history. And though the sound had stopped, the message hadn't. That was the moment when confidence turned to silence, and silence might finally turn to truth. The moment the hearing adjourned, the quiet that had gripped the room didn't dissolve. It followed everyone out the door. Reporters whispered instead of shouted. Cameras stayed fixed, hoping for one more look, one more reaction. Even the shuffle of footsteps down the marble hallway seemed softer, as if everyone understood they had just witnessed something that didn't need commentary. It needed processing. Inside, Judge Aileen Cannon gathered her files with mechanical precision. Her face was unreadable, but her movements were slower than before. The confidence that had carried her through the first half of the hearing had dulled, replaced by a quiet awareness that the story was no longer under her control. Across the room, Jasmine Crockett rose from her seat, her expression composed but distant. She wasn't triumphant. She was measured. Because she knew what would happen next. The media storm, the distortion, the endless rewrites of what people thought they saw. And she also knew something far more powerful. Truth doesn't need volume to echo. Media. Whiplash within minutes. Headlines exploded. Crockett silences Judge Cannon with one question. Cannon's composure cracks under pressure. A congressional showdown goes viral. Cable news ran split screens. Looping. Crockett's words against Cannon's pause over and over, as if replaying the silence might reveal a deeper meaning. Some anchors praised Crockett's courage. Others accused her of grandstanding. Analysts debated whether the moment was a gotcha or a necessary awakening. But one thing united every outlet, left and right alike. They couldn't stop talking about it. Clips flooded social media. The video was reposted with captions, slow-motion edits, reaction GIFs. Within hours, it had millions of views and 1,000 interpretations, but what none of the headlines captured was the atmosphere that couldn't be filmed, the feeling of a room where truth had briefly outrun politics. Public reaction, shock, pride, and polarization online. The reaction was instant and divided. For some, Jasmine Crockett became a symbol of courage, a reminder that even in the most controlled spaces, power can still be held accountable. They shared her words like a rallying cry. Impartiality isn't just claimed, it's demonstrated. For others, it was seen as disrespect, a challenge to decorum, an attack on the sanctity of the bench. They defended Cannon's composure, framing her restraint as dignity under fire. But beneath the noise, a quieter conversation began, one not about politics, but about trust. Ordinary citizens started asking questions that went beyond party lines. Can the system still self-correct? Does accountability have a place when power wears a robe? And what happens when silence becomes the loudest answer? For once, people weren't just watching. They were thinking early consequences within days. Official statements trickled out. Cannon's office issued a brief remark emphasizing the importance of judicial independence and decorum. It sounded professional, but sterile. Her response designed to move past the moment without engaging it. Meanwhile, Crockett's staff released a single sentence to the press. Accountability is not confrontation, it's democracy in action. That line, simple and sharp, became the quote of the week. Pundits dissected it endlessly, trying to decide if it was brilliance or provocation. But to the people who had watched that moment live, it was something else entirely: clarity. Even political allies who usually stayed silent began to speak cautiously about patterns of perception in the judiciary. It was subtle but unmistakable, the ripple effect of a single question starting to shift the tide. Tone shift, from chaos to reflection. By the end of the week, the storm began to settle, but not fade. The conversation had moved from sound bites to reflection. Think pieces appeared, with titles like The Courage to Ask and When. Silence speaks for the system, commentators, who had once scoffed at Crockett's style now acknowledged that she had touched something real, something uncomfortable but necessary. In interviews, when asked if she regretted the question, Crockett's response was calm and consistent. If truth makes people uncomfortable, that says more about where we are than where I stand. It wasn't defiance, it was conviction. And that's what made this moment different from every other viral clash. It wasn't born from outrage, but from evidence. The world had seen many confrontations between power and politics before, but this one was different because for once the aftermath wasn't chaos. It was consequence, no shouting, no spectacle. Just a shift, subtle, undeniable, toward a truth that had waited too long to be asked. The fallout had begun, but the reckoning was only getting started. When the noise faded, when the headlines lost their shine and the trending clips disappeared from feeds, one truth remained. This wasn't about a single question or a single courtroom. It was about what that moment revealed, not just about two people, but about all of us. Because what Jasmine Crockett asked wasn't just directed at Judge Aileen Cannon. It was a question aimed at every institution, every leader, every citizen who claims to stand for justice. At what point does discretion stop being neutral and start being selective? That question still lingers, because deep down everyone recognizes its relevance. Whether in a courtroom, a newsroom, or a boardroom, power often hides behind process. And when it does, truth becomes the quietest voice in the room. This confrontation stripped that illusion bare. It reminded millions that truth doesn't belong to authority. It belongs to accountability. In an age where confidence can masquerade as competence, and opinion often outweighs evidence, Crockett's calm insistence on clarity felt revolutionary. She didn't yell. She didn't accuse. She simply asked, and in doing so exposed how fragile certainty becomes when faced with facts. That's why this moment matters, because it forces a question that reaches beyond politics, beyond partisanship. Do we still have the courage to question power, not out of hatred but out of hope? History doesn't always move through riots or revolutions. Sometimes it shifts quietly, in a single pause, a single silence that forces reflection. This was one of those moments. It showed that courage doesn't always wear a cape or carry a microphone. Sometimes it sits across from authority, looks it in the eye and says, "Explain yourself." And in doing so, it awakens something larger, the reminder that democracy isn't self-sustaining. It survives only when ordinary people defend the truth, because when truth finally speaks, even softly, the world has no choice but to listen. Long after the hearing ended, people weren't just talking about what happened. They were feeling it. That's the power of truth when it finally breaks through the static. It makes you question not just the world around you, but the one inside your own mind. So, let's pause for a moment, strip away the politics, the titles, the sides, and think personally. Have you ever believed something so confidently, only to find out later it wasn't true? Maybe it was a story, a headline, or even a person you trusted. How did that moment change you? Did it make you angry or aware? We all like to think we're on the side of truth. But truth isn't a team, it's a responsibility. And it doesn't belong to the loudest voice. It belongs to the bravest listener. That's what this story is really about. Listening beyond certainty. When Jasmine Crockett asked that question, when does discretion become selective? She wasn't just challenging a judge, she was challenging us to stop confusing confidence with credibility, to stop rewarding those who speak louder than they listen, to start paying attention to how people answer when they're finally confronted with honesty, because truth doesn't always arrive in a headline or a hashtag. Sometimes it shows up in the silence that follows a question too powerful to ignore. Maybe you've seen it in your own life, at work, in your community, even within your own beliefs. Moments when something didn't feel fair, but you stayed quiet because the person in power seemed untouchable. This story reminds us that silence can protect power, or it can expose it. The difference lies in whether we choose to speak. So, what would you have done in that room? Would you have stayed silent, or would you have asked the question that needed to be asked? Because truth doesn't need an audience to exist. It only needs someone brave enough to notice it. When the dust settled, one truth became undeniable: the power of a single question. Not because it embarrassed authority, not because it went viral, but because it reminded everyone watching that truth still matters, and that silence, when used wisely, can be the loudest form of courage. Judge Aileen Cannon and Jasmine Crockett may have returned to their separate worlds, but the echo of that exchange didn't fade. It kept traveling, through screens, through conversations, through the quiet corners of people's minds, asking the same question over and over again. What do you do when truth and power collide? That's not just their question, it's ours. Because democracy isn't a spectacle we watch, it's a commitment we keep. Every time we question what we're told, every time we seek evidence before opinion, every time we demand fairness from those who claim to serve justice, we participate in its survival. The truth doesn't shout. It doesn't beg to be heard. It waits patiently for someone willing to listen. If you've made it this far, you've already proven something important, that you care about more than noise. You care about clarity, honesty, and courage. So don't let this moment end here. Be part of what comes next. Share the story. Ask your own questions. Challenge comfort. Defend truth. Because the world doesn't change when the powerful speak. It changes when the rest of us finally stop whispering. Subscribe. Stay curious. Keep questioning. The truth is still waiting, and you just proved you're ready to hear it.